Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. Today we're going all the way back to square one, or rather all the way back to square zero. That's right, we're talking about the all-important Session Zero. So what is it? How does it work? Why do I think it's important? Well, without making you all wait any longer, let's get started and let's learn something. Let's begin at the most logical place to begin, and that's with definitions. So what is a Session Zero? Well, that'll depend on who you ask, so I'm going to give you the broadest definition that I can think of and work out the details later on when I start talking about how Session Zeros can work, because as you might have guessed, there are many ways you can go about it, and when I start talking about the things you might discuss during a Session Zero, because again, as you might have guessed, there are many, and no two groups will treat it the same way, or talk about the same things. So what was that broad definition that I mentioned so long ago? Well, I define a Session Zero as any session that you have with your group before the actual campaign begins. So for this reason, you're obviously not playing the game. This means that generally the kinds of things you might do during a Session Zero are things that might help you get ready for the game, like discussing player and DM expectations, setting any group rules, and talking about the kinds of things that each member of the group, including the DM, wants to get out of the game, because we're all here to have fun, and that includes the DM. Some other things that you might want to do during a Session Zero, especially if you have new players, is help with character creation, clarify game rules, and even talk a little bit about your characters and how the DM might plan to incorporate them all into the story, if that's how you intend to play. And as you might have guessed, this will be the first potential Session Zero activity that I'm going to talk about. Some of my very first ever Session Zeros that I ever ran or took part in were like this, and I can definitely see the use if you have a lot of players who are new or don't really care whether or not their parts of their backstories are a secret at the start or not. It definitely fosters a kind of collaborative setting where everyone is open and learning together and streamlines the whole process of character creation, introduction, and incorporation. But as you might have guessed, you need to know what works for you and what works for your table. And as you also might have guessed, this isn't my preferred reason for having Session Zero. When it comes to character creation, I prefer to meet my players individually, whether that be over the phone, by text, or actually in person. This allows me as a DM to give them my full attention so that we can both do our best to create a character they want to play, because that's important. You don't want to get stuck playing a character that you don't realize isn't for you until later on. I've done that, I've had players do that, and it's no fun. It also allows us to work out any backstory stuff, as well as how they will be related to the story from Session 1 and onward throughout the entire campaign, as well as how I intend to introduce them during the first session. Especially, it allows it to be a surprise to the other players, and even allows me to have enough information so that I can surprise the player whose character I'm working with. I like to add fun little twists to players' backstories, but I want to say a word of warning and make sure you get their permission first, and if they aren't okay with it, don't do it. Easy. And honestly, as a DM, and even as a player, I probably spend more time on backstory stuff than on rule-based stuff anyway. After all, that is the whole story, isn't it? The rule stuff is just kind of a framework for us to work in, just gives us kind of a framework to work in. And in terms of character introduction, I find that myself and most of the tables that I've worked with prefer to hold off on introductions till the first session. It's fun to see everyone's characters for the first time, but that doesn't mean you still can't coordinate classes and abilities and just things that your character's good at in general. You absolutely can. Just don't talk about who or what your characters are, and don't share anything about their backstories. But that's enough about character creation. Now, we'll talk about some of the things that I like to do, and that I like to bring up during Session Zeros that I might run, or be a part of. First up, expectations. Actually, let's reword that. I don't like calling it expectations because that feels too regimented to me, like I'm a teacher or a manager, not a DM or a player. And instead of calling it expectations, I prefer to say that we're going to discuss the kind of game the DM is planning to run and the kind of game the players might prefer. In short, I like to say that we're discussing what everyone wants to get out of the game. You're kind of saying the same thing, but expectation seems to imply that it has to be a certain way, whereas discussing what everyone wants out of the game is a lot more inclusive and flexible, like you're willing to bend and change because you should be willing to bend and change. We all should be. It's a group effort after all. Alright, so enough on definitions again. Let's examine what I actually discuss when I talk about what everyone wants out of the game. Well, the first, and probably most obvious of the things this might entail, is what each player wants to see and encounter in the game. In short, if you're a DM, you want your players to have fun, so ask them if there's anything that they would want to experience in the game. Obviously, you can't do everything, but I think that a good player will understand that and not expect you to have to. Also, I don't just ask this during a Session Zero, I also try, emphasis on the word try, to ask this privately as well while the player in question and myself are working on their character, because they might not just want a certain encounter type or a monster or something like that to be working into the story. They may also have an idea for how their backstory can come into play, and they may not want to say anything in front of all the other players, which makes sense, and as long as they aren't trying to write the whole story for you, you should be completely open to this. Again, as DMs, we can't do everything, and as players, we need to understand that. Asking them before the Session Zero, and maybe even multiple times, also serves to give them extra time to think about what they might want, so they don't feel like they're on the spot. But that's not usually what I mean when I start talking about what we want out of the game. When I talk about what we all intend to get out of the game, I'm talking about the general type of game that we're going to be playing, and this is more important than it might at first seem. If there's a disconnect between the kind of game the DM is planning on running and what kind of game a player might want, and there's no communication about this, no one's going to be having any fun. Not the player, because it's not going to feel like what they signed up for, and not the DM, because they'll have players who are engaged in pushing the story forward, and they'll have no idea why. I've had this happen a few times, both as a player and as a DM, and it's definitely something that we want to avoid. It's important to bring this up during the course of the campaign if it ever crops up, but I think that if anything, this is a good reason to try to bring it up during a session 0 so that you can minimize the chances of this happening in order to ensure that everyone is having as much fun as possible. Now, it still could come up obviously, but addressing this before the campaign even begins is a crucial step in avoiding this phenomenon as much as you possibly can. In a way, you're kind of being proactive about it, and that's a common theme throughout anything you might discuss during a session 0. After all, that's why you want to discuss it during a session 0 so that you can avoid problems in the future. My next point is proactive in the very same way, and it's about setting ground rules, which may sound kind of managerial or teachery again, but those ground rules aren't just for the DM. Now, everyone's important in this game, and everyone deserves to have fun, and a lot can happen in D&D, and there are just some things that some players aren't comfortable seeing or experiencing. I like to ask that during a session 0, but I usually don't expect a lot from that, because a lot of people might not be comfortable saying whatever it is out loud like that, so I also ask in private, and even then, people might not want to say it out loud, and that's fine. I try to make it clear that that's fine. The point of this isn't really to get that response immediately. When I do that, what I'm trying to do is ensure that my players know that this is an environment which is open, in which they can feel free to openly address anything mid-session or anything that happens they aren't okay with. Then I'll simply change it and move on. Now, one last point I want to make here before moving on, and that's that I haven't personally run into this a whole lot myself as a DM, and that's because I try to keep my campaigns pretty PG, but again, that might differ for every group. You might think something you put into your campaign might be completely innocuous, but one of your players might disagree, and if they do, that's fine. Change it and move on. That's part of being cooperative. Alright, now on to the final point. I also like to use session 0s to bolster group cohesion, especially if this is a group where the majority of the members don't know each other. One way I like to do that is by keeping my session 0s kind of loose. I'll purposefully get sidetracked or allow us to get sidetracked and just kind of start talking. Before you know it, introductions will be made and new friendships will be forged in no time. And actually, isn't that one of the points of this game, I think, to spark new friendships? Another way that I like to do this is by bringing a game for us all to play when we're done discussing stuff during our session 0. I actually brought a cooperative board game to the last session 0 that I ran, and it went off perfectly. And finally, let's just talk a little bit about how important session 0 is if you aren't already fully convinced yet. I know I usually say that what you do depends on you and your table, but I honestly can't recommend a session 0 enough. Not only can it keep anyone from becoming perhaps a little uncomfortable on the road, but it can also help to boost player engagement, and it isn't difficult to see how. If you're running the type of game that your players want, they'll probably be at least a little bit more engaged in the game. And as a quick and perhaps slightly random side note, incorporating what your players want does not necessarily mean sacrificing what you want or are otherwise good at. I see no reason why you can't do both. Say your players want a dungeon crawl and you're better at political intrigue. You can have political figures give your players dungeon crawl quests and have the political stuff dependent on what your players do on those quests, who they retrieve the crown for, who they attack for who, and what else that they might do. Besides, I always say that everyone should be having fun, and that includes the DM. You should have fun too. But back to the current topic, session 0s are usually a great way of dealing with potential conflict before it even arises, kind of being proactive in this way. I know I said this is going to be a theme in this episode. You can talk about these kinds of things that are and are not okay to do at the table, for example, language, and a whole host of other things. And take it from me, I used to not use session 0s a lot, but I've run campaigns where there was a disconnect and where conflicts arose in which a session 0 would have probably very easy fixed long before that even occurred. But this episode went on a little bit longer than I intended it to, so with that, I leave you. Thanks so much for watching, if you made it this far, and I really hope that you found this useful. Be sure to check out this week's other video. It's all about the first in a series of stories that I'm going to tell from another campaign that I recently ran. It's actually the introduction of one of the characters in that campaign, and I know it's just one character, but it was quite memorable, and I hope you'll enjoy it. The campaign itself was shorter than the campaigns I usually run and like to tell, but it went really well in my opinion. It was actually my very first short style campaign, and everyone had fun, I had fun, and I've been looking forward to telling it for quite some time, so I hope you enjoy it. Also, feel free to come back next week where I'll talk about the exact opposite of this week's DM advice topic, and that is the epilogue session. I'll also tell the second story in that campaign series I was just talking about. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you found it useful, and of course, as always, and until next time, let's learn something.